Okay, what a great start to the day. Our two keynote speakers raised just, I think, the perfect issues to sort of lead the discussion into the rest of what we're going to be talking about, which is sort of laid out as the political science perspective, if you will, here, and then a more of a national regional perspective from groups that are working with people in the community, and then the afternoon a little bit more focused on Iowa groups in the community. And to lead this session, we have Barbara Baccaro, who's a professor in the College of Public Health in the Department of Community Behavioral Health and does community-based outreach types of research, and she'll introduce our speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, I'm sure you can hear me. You might not see me, but I'm here. So this is a terrific day, and thank you for being here. Again, I'm very excited to be part of this panel. So I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then they will go in the same order that I'm introducing them, and then we'll open it to questions. Remember to use the cards that we have in the tables for your questions, so we'll bring it up, and then we'll have the open conversation. Let me make sure. So yeah, we'll do questions at the end. So David Leal, thank you for being here today, is a professor of government and faculty associate of the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas in Austin. His primary academic interest is Latino politics, and his work explores questions involving public policy, public opinion, and political behavior. He has served as a co-chair of the American Politic Science Association's Committee on the Status of Latinos and Latinas in the Professions, is a member of APSA's task force on religion and American democracy, and is a APSA congressional fellow in the Office of the U.S. Senator. Francisco Pedraza is an assistant professor in political science at Texas A&M University. His research focuses on explaining the causes of contemporary immigration enforcement, as well as the consequences of discrimination, deportation, and the state of immigrant policy and Latino political attitudes, their voting behaviors, and the use of social welfare programs. And our own Rene Rocha, which is an assistant professor political science here at the university. His current research focuses on racial ethnical politics, public policy, state and local politics, and he has published in numerous journals as well as edited volumes. He's currently completing a project on the implications of recent immigration and enforcement policies. So help me welcome the panel, and we'll start with David. Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank you for inviting me to this conference. I've never been to Iowa before or seen, of course, the University of Iowa, but I'm really happy to be here and see the state and the university. And also thanks for the two speakers who got this event off to a great start. I thought they were really great, so I was really happy to be here. Just to hear them talk alone was worth the trip out here. I almost kind of feel like a preacher here. I see the stained glass, and this is an old church. It's not your usual academic conference, so I feel like I should be like giving maybe a religious talk of some kind. I do study and teach religion and politics too. Maybe I should teach a class in a place like this. That would be great. So I'm going to talk about the interrelated topics of immigration policy and the Latino vote, particularly in the context of the 2016 election. Despite all the media coverage, that's actually about 18 months away. So even though it suggests that there's going to be an election any minute now, I think that anything that we say is sort of in the realm of educated guesses. So maybe you can think of this as the old joke about free advice. It's worth every penny. And I'll also cover some of the more general political dynamics of recent years, because I think it's difficult to talk about immigration policy and the Latino vote in isolation from larger trends that are going on in public opinion and voting. And I'm also particularly interested in how the Republican Party might want to respond to the changing demography of the United States, because as the speakers have pointed out already, this is a really difficult issue for the GOP. It pits, for example, long-term versus short-term interests against each other. It creates dynamics in primary elections that can hurt them in general election campaigns. It divides the party. It hurts GOP candidates in some key states. It gives Democrats a wedge issue with Latino and Asian American voters. I'm going to talk about the Asian American vote and how that's been trending Democratic lately. A wedge issue with those voters who might otherwise be moderates or even conservatives. And it also, I think, in a larger way, brings up debates about what is conservatism, what should Republicans believe, and what really are conservative core values. So even though immigration reform, just to go back a little bit, is stuck in Congress today, I think there's some reason for optimism, because it was really close to passing it a couple of times during the Bush and maybe even the Obama administrations. So you go back to, for example, the early part of the 21st century. If it had not been for the 9/11 terror attacks, it's possible that immigration reform would have passed early in Bush's first term. The issue didn't come back because of foreign policy until 2006 and 2007. But despite the efforts of George W. Bush and John McCain, it didn't pass, but it came very close to doing so. The only thing that we had in those years was the border wall expansion bill that was passed and signed. And even during the 2008 and then later on the 2012 campaigns, the candidates had positions, but in many ways the issue was just not one of the major issues of the campaign. If you remember the debates and the whole general election, there really just wasn't a lot of discussion about this issue. There was a lot happening in immigration policy. There was a great number of deportations, about 400,000 per year, averaged in the last decade or so. And there were a lot of opinions about immigration, especially in Congress. But it was an issue that in some ways had not exactly fallen off the radar screen, but it wasn't an issue that really generated a lot of sort of a debate during the general election campaigns. But then a series of events brought it back onto the agenda. So it's an issue that kind of goes hot and cold. So in 2012, when Barack Obama won over 70% of the Latino vote on his way to re-election, there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who are, first of all, surprised by his victory, and there are also people who are surprised at how strongly the Latino vote was trending toward the Democrats. And so there's people who are connecting the dots within the GOP, and a new conversation began after the 2012 election. Can we win elections without taking into account the growing diversity of the nation and the electorate? And this worry changed the immigration debate in the aftermath of the 2012 campaign. Discussions of deporting grandma were replaced with negotiations, maybe about a pathway to citizenship. And then to go back a little bit in the past, forgotten now perhaps, but the 2013 Virginia and New Jersey gubernatorial elections. They also suggested the influence of Latino voters and how Republican candidates could take different positions on the immigration issue. Then there was the negotiated end to Alabama's immigration enforcement laws, which were at the time considered among the toughest in the country. And the federal courts overturned a lot of the Arizona immigration legislation. So things seem to be trending in one direction for immigration policy and immigration reform. But then you had the 2014 midterm elections, which I think seemed to suggest to some that maybe this growing diverse electorate really wasn't necessary for Republican victories, and that maybe on immigration reform, a more enforcement-oriented approach, I won't necessarily call it a conservative approach, because I think conservative thought can lead to different types of immigration policies, but maybe some people thought that this more enforcement-oriented approach was enough to lead to GOP victories, so maybe there was no need to make any changes there. But I think there are some difficulties with that argument, particularly the confusion of turnout effects with the partisan effect. It was one of the lowest turnout elections in recent memory. And there's also the issue of which Class II Senate seats are up for election in 2014, which I think will be very different from those up in 2016. So I wouldn't say that 2014 represents a kind of status quo that's going to carry on to the future. And I think we should also discuss some other features of American politics that might change the immigration policy conversation. And so I'd like to suggest that the policy environment may have been and still may be riper for change than is often thought. So some people say the U.S. is in the midst of a nativist period, that not really much can be done, there's too much grassroots opposition to immigration. I'm not entirely sure about this. I think the immigration climate of the 2000s did see a lot of unprecedented levels of immigration enforcement and deportations. But I think there are other signs to suggest that the political environment of the U.S. can't just be simply characterized as nativist. For example, while some localities and states are going out of their way to create new immigration enforcement laws and to make life more difficult for immigrants, a report by the Woodrow Wilson, the Wilson Center found that just as many jurisdictions sought to expand immigrant rights as to restrict them, although those efforts actually don't get very much press. And I think that these kind of laws at the local and state level in many places suggest that the policy environment all along has been perhaps less anti-immigrant than is often assumed, or at least that there are regional and other kinds of variations and complexities out there. And so if no side is clearly dominating the policy arena, there seems to be a standstill. And when you look at public opinion surveys, I think there's a lot of support for comprehensive reform, but it also depends on the questions that you ask, and there's a lot of ambiguity in public opinion data. Then it means that maybe the political stream, a University of Michigan scholar, John Kingdon, called it, a change in the politics stream, can really be influential here. And I think that the politics stream may actually be presidential elections. We've talked about the difference between congressional and presidential elections, but if the Democratic nominee, whoever it may be, wins in 2016 and does so with large support of Latinos as well as Asian American and also African American voters, then the GOP may have to again reconsider how it appeals to the changing electorate, which could provide a strong spur for immigration reform. And I also think we shouldn't study immigration policy in isolation from other kinds of policy developments. So I think we need the perspective of time a little bit here, but there may be a kind of an emerging libertarian dimension in public policy that may influence several debates. The most often noted is the same-sex marriage debate, but there's also marijuana decriminalization. So public opinion in these issues has been changing slowly but surely over time. And the graphs actually show that the line have crossed already, where there's more support than opposition for same-sex equality and some rethinking about the war on drugs. So I think that we see this kind of change in support, and this may have something to do with immigration also. So think about the way that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell military policy changed quite a bit. Think about how all the controversy back in the early 1990s, if you remember that, and then think how it was repealed by Congress in 2012 with very minimal controversy. Think about the way that same-sex marriage has been approved by voters in a growing number of states. It used to be said, well, these are judges or legislatures that are doing this, but now we're seeing grassroots support. We see similar dynamics with marijuana legalization or decriminalization. People are becoming more supportive of this over time. It's a steady, slow trend, not just the reaction to one event. These are continuing changes that will be, I think, very difficult to reverse. And so I think that because of this, we might be seeing kind of new thinking about the role of the federal government, people who are thinking seriously about what a small government means, what a limited government means, what principled conservatism means in politics. And so I think that this also maps on to the relatively low trust in government that we see, especially the federal government. And these influences don't necessarily map straight onto our existing Democratic-Republican Party lines. So I think that a principled position of limited government could lead some Republicans to new thinking about immigration policies, as well as policies that involve same-sex equality and drug control. I think we're also seeing a change in the religious dynamics that are helping to promote comprehensive immigration reform. Many evangelical leaders and organizations are now advocating a more compassionate approach to immigration reform, including a path to legalization. And this is beyond the usual group of groupings of liberal religious groups who tend to have, not perhaps as much power as they used to have in American politics. And this is also partially sort of an evangelical, I think, bubbling up of new ideas about biblical teachings about the stranger, the sojourner, and the immigrant. And this is also what I think is a subset of the growing, what some people call red letter Christianity, meaning taking seriously the actual words of Jesus in the Bible and de-emphasizing the political and the partisan interpretation of these words. Many evangelicals, especially the young, have become increasingly worried that the Bible has been hijacked by partisan politics, and we're seeing that, I think, playing out in the immigration debate. There's also a demographic feature to religious change that reflects the growing Latino presence in evangelical and Pentecostal churches. For instance, while Latinos are still predominantly Catholic, Time magazine noted that there's a Latino Reformation that's changing American Protestantism. American Protestants are very interested in evangelizing Latinos, but it's hard to evangelize people who are being deported in large numbers or living in fear of being caught driving without documents, and so maybe don't go to church but stay home on Sunday. Whether the rank and file follows these kinds of evangelical leadership and organizational changes is unclear, but I think it's a really interesting development. It's also possible that together Latino, African American, and immigrant populations may have passed a kind of electoral tipping point beyond which anti-immigrant politics is just self-defeating. So as we know, Latinos have gained numbers steadily for a number of decades, but they're also in many states and locales where they just would not have been found in any significant numbers a couple of decades ago. So where elections in those states are close, Latinos can make a difference because the Latino vote is contingent. It's contingent on how other groups vote. So if non-Latinos are voting in a narrowly divided election, then you don't have to have a really large Latino population for them to make the difference in the outcome. And if you also look at some of the battleground states, you see how growing Latino populations in those places can make a difference. So states like North Carolina, Virginia, Indiana, Iowa, some of these states have been in play in recent presidential elections. Part of that is because of just general demographic changes. Some of those involve Latinos, some of those don't. But you look at Latinos in large states, and sometimes they don't make very much of a difference because the politics are all red or all blue, despite their large numbers. I think we also want to think about the growing Asian American population that's been strongly trending Democratic over the last couple of decades. The Asian American vote for Obama was stronger than the Latino vote for Obama in 2012. Not many people know about this, but they're becoming electorally consequential. Asian Americans are about 6% of the U.S. population and about 3% of the electorate. When elections are close, you don't want to lose 3% of the electorate. That's a lot of people. The Asian American population in the 2010 census grew to about 17 million people, and about 3/4 of Asian Americans are foreign-born. So the immigration is particularly relevant to this community, and they may very well be sensitive to heated immigration politics. Even if the politics are directed at Latinos, they still realize that they're foreign-born, the immigration issue is relevant to them, and if one party is on one side and the other party is sending signals on the other side, that makes the vote easier. Asian Americans in 1992 voted only 30% for Bill Clinton, but they now voted about 30%, less than 30% actually, for Mitt Romney. So the Asian American vote is completely flipped at the same time that it's growing, which has to be a concern to Republicans, along with the demographic changes that we're seeing with other groups. One key question is how immigration influences the Latino vote, and I think the past speakers have brought up some important facts. When Latinos go to the polls, they don't just automatically vote on immigration, they vote on a lot of the other issues. If you just ask people, what are the key issues that are important to you, they say things like everybody else does. Jobs, the economy, the war on terror, education. Depending on the year, the issues change a little bit, but at no point really is education like right there at the top of the list for Latinos like it is for anybody else. But I think there's an important distinction here, which is about what I think of as immigration policy versus immigration politics. And I think that the exact nature of Latino public opinion about possible policy reforms may be less important than their more general understanding that the politics of immigration have become very negative. So when the debate moves from good faith discussions about what policies are best to contentious debates that question the place of all Latinos in America and threaten to deport grandma, it's no surprise that you're going to find election results like 2008 and 2012. So when you have a policy environment where you move beyond these kind of abstract thinking about this policy or that policy, it becomes about Latinos and it becomes about negativity toward Latinos, and Latinos understand that, they see that. In fact, Latino views about immigration have historically been more diverse than people think. A lot of people assume that Latinos are in favor of a kind of open border policy, but that's not true. You go back to public opinion surveys in the 1980s and the 1990s, you actually see a lot of evidence that Latino attitudes toward immigration are not liberal necessarily. They hold diverse opinions, including some that might be even considered conservative. But regardless of moderate or even conservative Latino views among some for immigration policy, they don't want a political debate that demonizes immigrants and indicts all Latinos. And because many Latino citizens are connected, as we've heard before, to lots of Latino non-citizens, it becomes personalized because they can put a face to the policy. The non-citizen who might be deported is not just an abstract, it's somebody they work with, someone they're related to. And that's also a big change as mass migration has sort of interconnected, I think, Latino citizen and non-citizen populations anymore. Even in 2012, there are a lot of activists who are criticizing Barack Obama for not being more active on the immigration policy issue. But even with this, and even with many people saying, well, look at all the deportations that have happened, isn't this somehow to blame the leader of the executive branch? But even so, Latinos strongly supported Obama over Romney. So I think Republicans face a status quo that doesn't have a lot of easy options. A legalization plan could alienate some parts of the conservative and Tea Party base while potentially, although I think there's reason to question this, creating millions of new Democratic voters. But the status quo is also potentially self-defeating. So if Democratic candidates continue to receive Latino votes in the 70% range, this is going to prove problematic to Republican Electoral College calculations and to some statewide Republican Senate and gubernatorial campaigns. For instance, the Democrats could consolidate a solid Southwest. Think about Democratic gains in places like Nevada and Colorado. They could regularly win Florida. They could tip swing states. Democrats don't need to turn Texas blue, which is something that we've heard about in the news recently. Republicans don't need to win the Latino vote to be competitive nationally, and we've heard that before, and I believe it's true. They just need to avoid 71 to 29% results. If they can win on average no less than maybe 1/3 of the Latino vote, which seems to be, pre-immigration politics kind of average, although it depends on the candidates, and if they can occasionally reach between the 35% of Ronald Reagan in 1984 and the 40% of George W. Bush in 2004, they'll be in much better electoral shape. And as we've also heard too, I think some Republicans may consider that the best solution is to take the immigration issue off the table, to lose on policy, to win on politics. And this also might enhance the prospects of their relatively deep bench, I think we have to say, of Latino Republicans. We see not just U.S. Senators Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio in the news lately. Let's not forget about Susana Martinez of New Mexico, Brian Sandoval of Nevada, not to mention newly elected Texas Land Commissioner George P. Bush. If the GOP is perceived as anti-immigrant, especially among immigrant and minority populations, will this limit their ability to win minority votes, even if they have Latino candidates on the top or in the vice presidential position? It's not automatic that minority candidates attract minority votes. A possible parallel might be President Clinton and welfare reform. PERWORA, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in the 1990s, which you may remember. Democrats perceived this to be a wedge issue that was working against them. In order to remove the issue from the agenda, the Democratic Party essentially, reluctantly, but they gave on substance in order to adjust to the political environment. Another possibility is that immigration reform may be affected by the nature of intra-Republican debates about a lot of issues, not just immigration reform. While generalizations can sometimes be difficult and parties certainly don't speak with one voice, perhaps the more moderate kind of establishment Republicans would like to move the GOP toward the ideological center, and part of this may be immigration reform. By emphasizing the fact of a diversifying electorate, these Republicans may also be trying to change the discussion from ideology to practicality. The impact of a Romney defeat may have opened a window for such a discussion. And I also think the prospect of Hillary Clinton winning in 2016 and 2020 may be really sobering for Republicans. We had heard that some Republicans in Congress say, who cares about the executive branch? We can control the House. Well, you're going to leave a lot on the table if that's really your feeling. How do you feel about giving the Democrats control of foreign policy for the next 8 to 9 years, judicial nominations? Even if Republicans have control of the Senate, you slowly are changing the nature of the federal judiciary, bureaucratic appointments, all the regulations that come out of the federal bureaucracy, executive orders, citing statements. You really want to just leave that on the table, GOP? I think there's a lot of problems with that kind of an argument. So there's a lot to lose. And some Republicans, I think, have felt that the GOP is the natural party of the executive branch. They often look back to the days of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, but perhaps those victories were built on a different electorate. And in fact, if you take the Romney vote and you take it and you put it back onto an earlier American demographic reality, then Romney wins. But you take the results of who voted for who with different demographic groups, and you run it in 2012 with an actual contemporary electorate, then the Democratic candidate wins. If nothing changes, I think the status quo favors the Democrats in a numerical political way, despite mass deportations, which is based on laws passed in the 1990s. It's really the GOP that's seen as the anti-immigrant party by immigrants and minorities, and you can look at survey questions that ask people, which party do you trust on the immigration issue, which party can handle the immigration issue better. And I just want to also say a couple of things, too, that talking about immigration also overlooks some changing demographic facts about Latinos. For example, 2/3 of all Latino population growth is natural increase, or birth minus deaths. We heard the earlier talk that talked about, number of Latinos being born and the number of Anglos dying. It's from 2000 and 2009, so during that last decade, there's 8 million Latinos. There's an increase in 8 million Latinos because of natural increase, not because of immigration. And this is twice as large as all white population growth. So even not including immigration, even if you stopped all immigration right now, as if you could, you would still have substantial Latino population growth and Asian population growth, and that's going to change the electorate quite a bit. So just to conclude, I think there are also other cases that can be made about immigration that are going to play out within Republican Party circles. There are a lot of libertarian cases that can be made for why immigration enforcement is a problem. Principled conservatives who believe in smaller governments don't think you can have a massive state enforcement bureaucracy here and believe that it doesn't have implications for anything else over there. There are people who would say, why should the federal government tell business owners who they ought to hire? Why shouldn't the government get out of this labor market kind of decisions and leave it up to businesses and entrepreneurs to make these decisions? And the last thing I'll say, too, is that I think that there's increasing research that suggests that even a mass legalization or amnesty, if you will, would not necessarily benefit the Democratic Party, at least not in the short term. When you look at the people who naturalized under the last immigration reform in 1986, IRCA, fewer than half of the eligible beneficiaries became citizens, and it took them a very long time to start voting and to get involved in the political stream. Even if you had a path to citizenship under today's comprehensive immigration reform, it could be long and costly and replete with all kinds of obstacles. And even those who reach the citizenship finish line may not vote, as lots of people naturalize for a variety of reasons, not just so that they can vote. So for an example, there's analysis by a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford that concluded, on the whole, the electoral effects, that is the potential electoral effects of legalization, are small and a weak excuse for Republicans to oppose comprehensive immigration reform with the pathway to citizenship. So on that, I will stop and hand it over to my colleague. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I also want to lay on some thanks for having been invited by Renee and also for the Policy Center for hosting what I think is a really important topic, not just in research, but out in the sort of community. There's a real hunger for understanding the politics of immigration, and one of the things that I'm most excited about, and I'm sort of regretting that I'm not going to touch too much up on this point, is that I think it's something that we can do something about. So while we're waiting for, okay, great, my slides are up. I want to jump right into the topic of immigration politics by addressing one of the most concerning narratives about the state of life in Latino America, and that's that there's a sizable share of folks who are, quote-unquote, living in the shadows. We found in some research that about 1 in 3 Latinos are holding back in some form of full engagement in public life in order to avoid scrutiny of their citizenship status. And by the way, that's not limited to just the foreign-born. This is something that extends to the U.S.-born, but you don't have to take my word for it. I'm going to show you with some data how we've managed to trace some of that to the way that people engage in a variety of public life that I think is really of consequence to what we see America taking shape and how we sort of define ourselves as a public. So to jump right in, I want to describe right up front that we're looking at some data that was collected very recently. This is survey data that I collected just in the last couple months. It was fielded January 29th through March 12th, and we've got a sizable representative sample of Hispanics numbering about 1,400. We've definitely updated our technology, and we've included folks that can take the survey not just by telephone in terms of landline and cell phones, but we've also extended our efforts to grab some of those folks that are also interested and available to do this through web-based interviews. About 1/3 of the people that we interviewed elected to take the survey and give us their responses in Spanish language. And I want to point out here that it was sponsored by a nonpartisan group, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They're especially interested in advancing our knowledge in health policy research. So this is definitely not partisan at all. They're just interested in how can we make America better, and especially on the topics that are near and dear to the public, like health. So what do we mean by living in the shadows? What I wanted to do, and this is something that political scientists are really interested in and obsessed with. We're trying to take ideas that we kick around in public discourse and put sort of numbers to it. How can we actually capture that in a quantitative form and get real accurate measures so that we both can agree, right? And when we're discussing this term living in the shadows, to what extent are people, in fact, living in the shadows? So what I did is I just asked people, have you ever avoided X activity because you don't want to be bothered or asked about your citizenship status? And I worded it that way because I wanted it to be something that even someone who was born in the U.S. or is naturalized could answer affirmatively to. And what I'm showing you here is the responses to this question for a variety of sort of public areas and locations in life, including, but not limited to, talking to police in order to report crime, renew or apply for driver's license, go to the airport to pick up family members, engage or use public transportation, driving in a personal vehicle, going to the doctor, and also meeting or speaking with teachers and school officials. The first thing that should stand out to you is that this is sort of a nice representative set of seemingly mundane activities, but it's the kind of day-to-day stuff that Americans do all the time. And what's really concerning here is that you've got sizable numbers, as many as 1 in 5, especially among those who took the interview or completed the interview in Spanish language, 1 in 5 who report. They tell us, we avoid contact and avoid reporting crimes to the police in order to avoid scrutiny of our citizenship status, right? And that is really alarming when we think about what the implications are then for police officers to do their jobs. They're out there on the streets trying to solve crimes, and a major sort of feature of their job is engaging and communicating with the public. So this is telling us that the public is actively disengaging. And another area of concern, right, is with respect to public health. If you look down to that chart, we have the number of people who avoid going to the doctor goes up as high as 1 in 6. 16% are telling us they avoid going to see healthcare providers. And this is problematic not just for the individual's health, but sort of from a community-based and community-wide public health perspective. And we see a lot of this come in the headlines, for example, on the debate around vaccinations. Big-time concerns about how the kinds of healthcare access that one individual or groups in a community have, they're not self-contained, they're not isolated, that they can spill over and have effects in the broader community. And then finally, to the extent that we take seriously our education, and I think we do, we've got a long commitment in America since the founding of the Republic to public education, that if we've got people who are saying that they avoid making contact and speaking with our educators, that's a real problem in terms of the kinds of performance that educators can have and the kinds of effects that they can have if a real channel of communication gets cut off between their clients and the parents of their clients. So one of the things that the earlier speakers had touched on is the idea that for Latinos, the issue of immigration is very personal, and what I'm showing you here is a set of bar plots that tell us how many people happen to know somebody who is an undocumented immigrant. And the thing that should jump right out at you immediately is that it is not a trivial number. We're talking about majorities of Hispanics, total majorities of Hispanics. 61% say they know somebody personally who's undocumented. And that number doesn't fluctuate too much when we slice and dice the data up by different demographic profiles. For example, according to income, it doesn't move particularly much. By sex, gender, it doesn't move very much. You do see a bit of a dip depending on whether Hispanics are married or single, but I think this is actually really concerning because what it's telling us is that folks who are married, folks who are more likely to have set roots in their local communities, they've got skin in the game, so to speak, they are the folks who are really tied to the fate of undocumented immigrants. So part of what I think is being articulated accurately by the earlier speakers is that the issue is personal, and we've got data here that suggests they're spot on. Now, what do we mean by personal? Is that something that is being reported rather gratuitously, as in I happen to know an acquaintance? The evidence says not at all. Actually, we have a majority of Hispanics among those who say that they know someone who's undocumented reporting that that's a family member or a friend, or a family member and a friend, excuse me. And the rest are saying that they're friends. And to the extent that we have these social ties and obligations to people, I think that that spells sort of the key mechanisms for why you might have someone who, for example, hears something along the lines that you are familiar with coming from restrictionists like Steve King. So policymakers often articulate this sort of idea that, no, what we can have is restrictive immigration policy and restrictive immigration enforcement that's very targeted. And it's not going to spill over and affect everybody. But actually, this says it totally does. Because it's personal, it's going to resonate in a much broader set of the public than I think policymakers might anticipate or be willing to admit. Another thing that I want to touch on here is, what do we mean then by the consequences to health of immigration enforcement and living in the shadows? I asked the question, do you worry that your friends or family members might be detained or deported due to their immigration status? And from the perspective of political scientists, this is sort of a way to capture the idea of political threat. And they celebrate it. They say that when citizens identify threat, what it does is it mobilizes them to be vigilant. And we want that in a democracy because a vigilant citizenry is, on average, a good citizenry. But if we go down the hall to our experts in public health and medicine, they say, whoa, hold on. This idea that people worry, this is problematic. This is not something to be celebrated because it represents a stressor. And a ton of evidence has amounted in the last 2 or 3 decades that says stressors are deleterious. They are bad for our mental and our physical health. You've got to be asking yourself then, what does this spell in terms of the kinds of demands that we can expect from a set of the public on our healthcare resources? Okay, that has big time implications. So I wanted to be a little bit more systematic because political scientists are often skeptical of the kinds of reports that we get from surveys, and we can do a little bit better by thinking about the gold standard of knowing differences. That's the idea of an experiment. So what I did is I used a very, very subtle experiment where I randomly assigned people to hear a cue. And then I asked them, I want to know, think about when you're making appointments to see a healthcare provider. With all the public attention to, and then I give them a cue, X. Does that make you more likely to use healthcare services? And what I did is I said, I'm going to make a control group. The control group is the one that's going to hear the cue with all the attention to healthcare. And let's be honest, there's been a lot of attention to healthcare in the last 5 years, right? What I found was that the folks who got that message, randomly assigned, 30% of them, 1 in 3, said that, yes, I'm more likely to go make an appointment to see a healthcare provider. But when I randomly assigned a different cue, one that brought up considerations of immigration policy and the immigration debate, what I found is that dropped in half. That is, people systematically are less likely to go see a healthcare provider if I cue them to think about the issue of immigration. Notice that I've got 2 different cues here related to immigration. The one in the middle is very subtle. It's just immigration issues. Then I really hit them over the head with a more powerful and direct cue by saying, with all the increased attention to more deportations. And I think what you should take note of here is that there's no difference between the two, which is, to me, suggesting that the subtle cue of immigration, right? You don't even have to go into the details of 400,000 deportations a year. Just saying the word immigration is enough to cue people, I'm staying away from healthcare providers. Why? I think a lot of it has to do with, that is a very intimate interaction that you have with another person where you divulge lots and lots of personal information, and there is a perception out there that that personal information may be used not just for the purposes of healthcare, right, but that it could be used in terms of providing a ready-made record that's available for immigration enforcement officials to use then to systematically target enforcement operations. So what? I've said a lot here that I think makes it very clear why immigration and immigration politics, immigration policy is of consequence to the Hispanic community and the immigrant proximate communities in America in general. But I want to invite you to think about how this matters for Americans in general. We pointed out earlier that 1 in 3 Latinos are holding back from full engagement in public life. But I want to underscore here that where this is happening, that it's impacting the jobs of policemen, educators, and healthcare providers. So to the extent that these professionals are undermined in their efforts to reach out and do right by the public that they're serving, this is a problem that I think all Americans have a stake in. I also want to underscore the idea that to the extent that we take seriously the idea that the U.S. is not an isolated nation in the world and that we are in fact competing on a global market, you've got to come to terms with the idea that there is no plan for a competitive America, none whatsoever that you can construct that can afford to exclude Latinos. Latinos are America. And if you want to be competitive on a global market, you absolutely have to consider them in your plans. And by the way, Iowa's not immune from this statement. I want to underscore really quickly, here's some evidence that shows that no retirement plan is possible without a Latino contribution based simply on demographics. On the left panel here, I'm showing you the distribution of age among Hispanics in the state of Iowa. On the right hand, what I'm showing you is the panel of the distribution of age among non-Hispanics. And I think what's key to understanding these demographic charts is that the distribution of young folks is very heavily concentrated in the Latino population. But you see that it's a little more evenly spread among non-Hispanics. And that has very serious consequences for how we fund a ton of social and entitlement programs that we all enjoy and that we all sort of anticipate are going to be there as we come to our retirement years. So the only way for us to manage these kinds of social programs for individuals that have put in their dues and are now happening to be entering their twilight years is to rely on a young workforce. And that young workforce is disproportionately located in the Latino population. Okay? I tell my students that I do try really hard to end on optimistic notes, but I want to underscore a couple of things of why I think the earlier speakers had it spot on in terms of their reasoning for why immigration policy and politics is going to remain on the public agenda. It's been unresolved for the last 10 years. And I see 2 reasons, right, why it's going to continue being that way. I'm showing you an image here of one of the immigration rallies that took place in 2006, and it really underscores sort of 2 ideas. One that's sort of embarrassing to political scientists, but one that's a little more suggestive and hopeful that we have something to say that's of value to the public. The one that's embarrassing is that we have to confess that we're terrible forecasters. We didn't know that these marches were going to happen, and a lot of us were finding that we had to backpedal on statements that we made regarding the propensity and the probability of Latinos to participate in politics. The other thing I want to underscore here is it is particularly concerning that immigration policy remains unresolved, given the following. It's very clear. There's no mixed signals. There is an issue public that favors immigration reform, and it's not limited or exclusive to the Latino population. Broad swaths of Americans want it. But the other thing that's really concerning here is that these 2006 rallies demonstrate the largest, by all indicators, the largest turnout of Americans to engage in peaceful rallies in the history of the United States. Not the last 10 years, not the last 20 years. It bests all of the rallies that turned out during the Vietnam era. It bests all of the rallies combined during the African-American freedom struggle. And what's concerning about this then is that a broad swath of the public goes out into the streets, peacefully demonstrates, throws a fit, and nothing happens. That's a problem because what it suggests, right, the signal that it sends is that government is not responsive. Okay? I want to address a little more systematically this idea of a graying population, and I want to direct it to direct our attention to the graying of our policymakers. What I'm showing you here is a really simple table of the average age of members in the U.S. Congress from 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And what you'll note is that both in the House and the Senate, we've got an increasing age in terms of years of our policymakers. And I think that's important to think about for how we understand this moment that we're in now. And the moment that we're in now is made clearest by thinking about the foreign-born population in the U.S., both as raw numbers and as a percentage. If you focused all of your attention on the raw numbers from 1850 to 2010, there's very clear a trend of increasing numbers of foreign-born population. But if we think a little bit more about the proportion of foreign-born in the United States, what this reveals is that the contemporary years is really approaching something that's a little more like the equilibrium that the U.S. has been in since the founding of the Republic, really. That the moment from about the 1940s through 1970 is an outlier. And that's critical to understand because those folks that I just showed you their age in the U.S. Congress, for them, their life experience is fundamentally located and informed by that moment that is an outlier in U.S. history. So for them, they wax nostalgic and think about a yesteryear of America that really, for all intents and purposes, is not representative of the Republic's experience. Okay? So how do we end then on an optimistic note? Part of me is concerned that there may not be much in the way of comprehensive immigration reform for the same reasons that we haven't seen it for the last 10 years. Quite frankly, not just the Republicans, but the Democrats have an incentive not to pass immigration reform. It's easy not to take action if all you've got to do is sit back and watch your opponents tear themselves apart. So the optimistic note is actually that demographic change, at least on this front, I think is going to create a new reality. So it's not by choice, but it's just sort of the shifts in the demographic grounds that candidates and campaigns and the public is going to be engaging that will spell meaningful differences. You get a very, very, very different take when, for example, I engage my students, undergraduates, who say, you tell this story about how America is very restrictive, or you have segments of the population that are very restrictive, but they're coming right out of their K through 12 experience. They've just entered college, and for them, they see that 1 in 4 of their peers are Hispanic or a part of immigrant proximate communities. So this is a new reality that's being constructed in the American public that just a short 20, 30 years from now will be the leaders in Congress and other policymaking venues. I think I'll leave it at that.
So the lesson that I want to offer here is twofold. The first thing I want to do is I want to offer some kind of bird's eye view insights from political science that we've known that are built upon decades of political science research that far precedes my involvement in the field, but that help to explain, when presented in a single cohesive narrative, the way in which immigration is going to have significant long-term ramifications for the American electorate, and in fact, ways in which it already has. The second thing I want to do, and that's going to offer a story which is, to give away the punchline, very favorable for the Democratic Party. The second thing I want to do is offer a second set of insights, which are born out of more contemporary research that I personally have been more involved in. And that message is going to temper enthusiasm from the first message, at least to those that might normatively like the outcome that I'm going to describe. That first lesson about what do we know from political science generally that's going to help us understand the way in which immigration is going to change the American electorate begins with stuff that we were researching in political science 40, 50 years ago, with the basic question of, why do people vote for the candidates they vote for? And the answer to that question is not going to be very surprising to you. It's because of their partisan affiliation, right? People who are Republicans vote for Republican presidential candidates. People who are Democrats are more likely to vote for Democratic presidential candidates. That's not insightful. But what was very insightful is our understanding of where a person's partisan identification comes from. And while it might be idealistic if we lived in a world in which people developed ideologies and developed policy preferences, and then joined political parties that were most aligned with those preferences, we know that that's not actually how the world works. Partisan affiliation, what party you belong to, is actually more of an emotive attachment. And it's a product of a lot of things, especially your socialization experiences, right? Being brought up in a Democratic or Republican household, that's going to bias your partisan affiliation long before you develop a cohesive ideology as an adult, assuming that you develop a cohesive ideology as an adult. The kind of groups you belong to, your racial group, your ethnic group, your occupational group, your income bracket, all of these things through social norms and pressures bias the types of bias your tendency to belong to one party or another. And so it's not actually the case that you choose a set of policy preferences and then you choose a political party which is most aligned to those policy preferences, but rather a reversal in which you are, through sociological forces, assigned a partisan identification. And then you actually, in some kind of through a process which is kind of perverse to democratic ideals, you develop policy preferences that are a function of your partisanship, so that you're not a Republican because you're conservative, but you're conservative because you're a Republican. You're liberal because you're Democratic, instead of the other way around. But the difference but that story is not universally true. When people, for Latinos, for immigrants, policy positions actually matter a great deal, right? Because by the nature of the immigration experience, you lack those strong socialization factors. First-generation immigrants are not reared in Democratic or Republican households, right? And so when they enter the United States and as they enter political life, their decision to become Republicans or to become Democrats have to be based upon other things. And so the importance of policy for this particular group becomes exaggerated relative to what it is for other segments of the electorate. But that carries forward into generations, so that second-generation Latinos are raised in families whose parents are kind of weak partisans, right? Because they were not strongly socialized in youth, right? And so it's a really multi-generational process in which policy positions matter more for Latinos than they do for other segments of the electorate. So that's the first lesson. Policy actually doesn't always matter for all groups. It matters more for Latinos and for immigrants generally than for other groups. So then we think to ourselves, all right, well, what are the policy preferences of Latinos, and how is that going to bias their tendency to become Republicans or to become Democrats? And some of the insights that the speakers this morning offered, that David and Francisco have offered already this morning, is that it's not just the case, you can't really view the Latino population monolithically. It's not that the Latino population is just liberal on immigration, right? There's a lot of evidence that the Latino population is actually pretty conservative on immigration, right? That they do have this restrictionist streak within the population. But that streak is biased in later generations, right? Second, third generation Latinos. First, the streak of the Latino population that is most likely to be expansionist, to be liberal on these issues, are first generation Latinos who are more closely connected to the immigration experience. There was a question this morning about social issues. And there was economic issues, and one point that the speakers made were that it was a myth that Latinos are socially conservative, and that Latinos and the economic issues are most important. That lesson itself is also not true uniformly across all Latinos. So that first-generation Latinos, right, they are more socially conservative than second or third generation Latinos. As Latinos acculturate or assimilate into American society, they become more socially liberal. And so, and also, they become more economically liberal. So you have to think about the segment of, so when Ronald Reagan says, in 1984, right, Latinos are Republicans, they just don't know it yet. The actual lesson is that first generation Latinos are Republicans. They just don't know it yet. But the trouble is, this segment of the electorate, which is most open to the Republican message, is the segment of the electorate which is dissuaded from becoming Republicans because of their stance on immigration. Right? And so the Republican message is not persuasive to later generation Latinos, but it's persuasive to the precise demographic of the Latino population that is alienated through the immigration debate. And that's the great irony, right, of Republican policy positions and as they play out within the Latino electorate. But you also have to appreciate the kind of long-term ramifications of what's happening here. So you take a cohort of first-generation Latinos, which maybe could have been Republican in a different environment in which Republicans weren't advocating very restrictionist immigration policy preferences. But because of immigration policy preferences, right, that segment of the Latino population becomes Democratic instead of becoming Republican. Well, that affects the way in which their households get socialized into the future. And that affects the way in which their households get socialized into the future. So that the actual electoral ramifications of what is happening today do not get felt today, right? They get felt in future cycles, right? They get felt a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades from now. And so the hole that the Republican Party digs for itself today with restrictionist immigration policy turns what could potentially be a significant advantage, or at least a very minimal disadvantage within the Latino community decades from now, into a potentially really significant systematic disadvantage, which is going to make it very difficult for them to win nationally. Right? They take a future in which they could regularly receive 35 to 40% of the Latino vote into a future in which they could perhaps regularly expect to receive 25, maybe even less, percent of the Latino vote. And so the way in which partisanship gets formed, the importance of ideology, the variance in the importance of ideology in partisanship and in vote choice across generations is the general lesson of political science that needs to be learned and needs to be appreciated by the Republican Party today. So that's a message which is very kind of hopeful for Democrats, perhaps it's a very dismal message for Republicans. But there's a second part to it, and that's how modern immigration politics ultimately affects Latino engagement within the political system. It does no good for Latinos to be Democrats in their heart, right, if they don't actually show up to the polls and vote Democratic. And what we know is that the modern way in which immigration enforcement is conducted through some research that's just really being done over the past couple of years, work that I've done, work that I've seen Francisco do, work that other political scientists throughout the country have done, is that it's changing Latino attitudes in a way which is lowering their engagement with the political system, which is increasing alienation, lowering the extent to which they trust government, lowering the extent to which they believe the government is responsive to their demands, ultimately making it less likely that they vote. And in order to really appreciate this, you have to understand the way in which, and this message perhaps has not been fully articulated yet today, the way in which immigration enforcement today deviates wildly from historical norms. I mean, we're talking 20 years ago of deportations numbering in the tens of thousands. We're talking about the early part of the 2000s of deportations numbering in 100,000. And we're talking today about 400,000 deportations in 2013. 400,000 people living in the United States being removed forcibly. Right? And so that number is very large in absolute terms. Right? I mean, think of this, more than a tenth of the state of Iowa every year, not over the course of the 2000s, every single year. Right? And it's large in absolute terms. It's very large in historical terms. That number has increased quite dramatically under the Obama administration. That it's not the case that under Democratic administrations those levels of enforcement decline. Even after 2012, when the president announces DACA, well, the number of deportations that occur in 2013, after we're re-emphasizing the prioritization of removals away from people who are not criminals or people who have met certain conditions, the number of deportations in 2013 is higher than the number of deportations in 2012. The number of deportations in 2014, it's slightly lower than the number of deportations in 2013, but we're talking about a dip to 380,000 or so from a peak of 410,000 or so. Right? The drop is not small, and the number is still historically very large. And so what we know is that the long-term ramifications of that process for Latino engagement in the political system is bad. That Latino trust in government declines, right? Again, the share of the Latino vote is declining, and the Latinos and that this is true, this effect is true across the population. Right? It's not just true for foreign-born Latinos. It's true for native-born Latinos too. Now, the substantive effects, what's the decline in engagement amongst the native-born Latino population versus the foreign-born Latino population? It's a little bit smaller, but the effect is there. And so if you have Latino engagement amongst the foreign-born population drawing, amongst the native-born population drawing, right, that's going to be problematic because one of the primary determinants of engagement with the political system is also this kind of socialization experience that I've described to you determines partisanship and ultimately determines vote choice. Being raised in politically engaged households, being involved in politically engaged social networks increases your turnout, increases your engagement. And so if turnout declines for foreign-born Latinos today, that declines the engagement of future generations of Latinos. Right? And so what you have are forces which are pushing in two directions. One, which is leading Latinos towards becoming increasingly democratic across time, creating an inertial process which is going to be more and more difficult for the Republican Party to dig itself out of. Two, a process which is making Latino involvement in the political system less and less over time, which is limiting the extent to which the Democratic Party can take advantage of that change in partisanship and identification. The reason why Latino attitudes are so important for determining their tendency to turn out is because Latinos are disadvantaged on every other aspect that we know determines why people participate in politics. Why people participate in politics is succinctly said in three different ways. They participate because they can, because they have education, because they have income, right? Because they have civic capacity that is gained through involvement in religious organizations or communal organizations, because somebody asked them to, because they're mobilized by the Republican or the Democratic Party or by interest groups, and lastly, because they want to, right? Because they have political orientations that lend themselves towards engagement. Think about all those predictors. Income. Latinos are disadvantaged relative to non-Latinos. Education. Latinos are disadvantaged. Other things which are associated with those kind of demographic characteristics. Age. Francisco has already showed us that the Latino population is youth truncated. Mobilization. We know in political science that the Latino population is far less likely to be mobilized than the white population. And so on every single one of those dimensions, the Latino population is disadvantaged. The one dimension in which they have historically been advantaged is the dimension of orientation. Because immigrants, Latinos generally, immigrants specifically, are opting into the American political system, they have tended to be very trustful for government, right? To have very positive views about government. And it's that thing, that single dimension in which the Latino population has been advantaged, that the modern day regime of heavy-handed immigration enforcement is reducing. Right? And so I just, want to say that to emphasize the possible significance of the coercive effect of the way in which immigration policy today is enforced, and which has continued to be enforced, and to which, if comprehensive immigration reform is passed, I still see it being enforced, because every single piece of comprehensive immigration reform legislation that I've seen proposed says that we will give more resources to immigration, customs, and enforcement in order to further secure the border and increasingly ensure that immigrants within the interior of the United States are removed. Right? That process is likely to continue. And so you have a portrayal of the Democratic Party owning the immigration issue, or having it be an issue which works for them, but it works for them in terms of how Latinos feel the Democratic or the Republican Party represents them. It's not an issue which will inevitably increase the number of Latinos who are showing up at the polls who are voting Democratic. And I think that is the larger point of caution which the party needs to be aware of. Okay, so and now I'm there. Yep.
All right, let's, we have some, go ahead, we can bring the questions. We have some questions here, so we're gonna begin. Some I can read, some I'll try my best. This is for Dr. Pedraza. Would you elaborate on the sample representativeness of your survey data, where respondents are random across the United States or selected from a particular area? Do you think this affects your findings? Excellent question.
It's absolutely a representative sample of the U.S. Latino adult population. It is drawing very heavily from the states where, of course, you have high levels of Latinos that already live there. So we don't, for example, have any Latinos, though there are, allegedly, some in North Dakota. But that doesn't make it, I'm not concerned about that. It's a representative sample of the entire U.S. adult population. So it's an accurate reflection. I think we can draw inferences about what sort of the typical experience is for Latinos at least in January 2015. Yeah.
Thank you. This is open for everybody, I think. How do you think the political landscape will be changed both in the state of Iowa and federally following the deportation? This is a local leader in the community here in Iowa, Pastor Max Villator. Maybe Rene can talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think that's a excellent example of the way in which that immigration enforcement could create political alienation amongst Latinos. So one thing that I didn't point out, that a lot of the research that I've seen Francisco, that I've seen other people present, is that we are able to draw distinctions between who is getting deported and the effect that has on the Latino community. And we know that the deportation of non-criminals has these especially coercive effects on the way in which Latinos feel towards government. And so, deporting 400,000 people is bad in terms of making Latinos feel like government. You got to think about the lesson that sends, right? Government's not there to listen to my policy preferences. It's not there to represent my views in legislation, right? It's there to take the pastor of my church and send him back to Honduras, right? That's effectively, what it did. And so the increasing tendency to deport non-criminals is I think especially troubling for trying to kind of create it's creating these types of alienations. And the thing I'll point out is that the Obama administration, in theory, is moving towards a policy of emphasizing criminal deportations to the non-criminal deportations, but the numbers really just don't bear that out. The number of non-criminals that have been deported goes up across time, and it goes up across time not necessarily relative to the number of criminals that are being deported across time, but because the overall number of people being deported over time increases. And so if you increase the overall number, it doesn't matter, even if the percentage, the balance changes a little bit, that means still the overall number of non-criminals being deported is going up across time, right? And ultimately, I think that's what's important, right? People don't care if 30% of all people being deported are non-criminals, or if 20% of people being deported, right? They care about the actual number of non-criminals that are being deported, and that number goes up, and that's still bad, even if the Obama administration changes kind of the ratio a little bit.
Maybe I'd say something else too. Political scientists talk about this term called social capital, which is sort of the connections that people have, the relationships, the sort of the embedded networks where not just one person, we're sort of embedded in a network with a variety of other people. And so there's some reason to think that when you deport such a large number of people, you're removing people from networks. You're removing people who have social capital. A lot of people who have been removed are legal permanent residents. They're people who've been here a long time. They have jobs. They have important positions like we were just talking about. You take these individuals out. You're not just removing individuals. You're taking people out of networks, and that can have negative consequences for immigrant communities, but also just for Latino communities and even all communities broadly.
I totally agree, and I'm going to take the liberty of comment on this too, is an additional concept that we think about in public health is that collective efficacy, right, which is along the lines of social capital, and this idea that together we can change things, right? And so when you see a person that is a leader in the community, like such Pastor Max, being removed, and after all the protesting and the letter signing and the organizing that came about trying to get that person not to deport it, and he still was deported. I think definitely sort of that step to that identity, right? That collective efficacy, we can do something. The outcome would have been very different if they say, okay, we're not going to remove them, and I think that the community would have feel good about the effort. And I wonder, as a resident of the community, I feel like, sort of we did all this and it didn't work, right? They still deported him. So very specific examples is what's happening. So this is sort of open-ended, I think. Maybe discuss the divide between divide Latinos. There's this idea of politics versus policy, and what's that divide the Latinos regarding those sort of the differences between politics and the policy, I guess. The question is, may divide Latinos with regard to politics and policy. That's what we got.
Well, since I was talking about this difference, I think that the main idea is that Latinos, if you hadn't had all the immigration enforcement, Latinos might have been, and if you look back at surveys from the 1980s and the 1990s, Latinos are open to a lot of positions on immigration. If you look at, for example, the landmark Latino National Political Survey, the first really true national survey of Latinos, which was conducted in 1989 and 1990, one of the surprising results was how many Latinos had, it appears, conservative opinions about immigration. There are large numbers of Latinos who thought that there were too many immigrants in America. And this surprised people, but I think if you're just talking about what the policies should be about immigration, you would, in normal circumstances, have a wide variety of views there. But when immigration becomes this political football that indicts all Latinos, then Latinos start to think it's really not about the policy, it's really about the politics, it's really about people who don't like me very much. And then that changes the whole dynamic of how immigration works as a political issue in Latino communities. So you take away the immigration politics, you can have discussions about policy. It's not that you have to have the most liberal immigration policy to attract Latino voters, not at all. You just have to take the politics out of it, the negativity out of it, and then you can have a discussion about immigration reform. So that's sort of the point I was trying to make, that the policy and the politics are related, but they're very different in that you take the politics out of it, and then you can focus on the policy, and I think that changes the whole debate, and it changes the political implications, the partisan implications too of the debate.
Thank you. This is another question for Dr. Pedraza. So I'm going to read the beginning here. So you describe several nuances of economic, social, public health effects of Latino withholding from engaging in public health policy, or going to the doctor, or going to their school to talk to teachers. Do you think these effects or processes are too complex to be used in democratic campaigning, or I guess democratic campaign messaging, to sort of sway the voters into voting or getting engaged?
Not at all. I think what I want to deliver, what I want to convey, is that while the evidence is coming from a set of the population that it's coming from Latinos, that's the evidence. What I want to do is show you that it's having an effect on how other Americans are going about their day-to-day lives. Like, I think police are important. I think doctors are important. I think educators are important. And if you agree with me, those are kinds of issues that come up. They're staple issues in all political campaigns, national, state, local. So it absolutely is evidence and information that could be useful and resonate with a much broader public.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Given that, and this is open, given that Latinos are disproportionately targeted by police and law enforcement, how does this interact with deportations? How do Latinos respond to this?
Well, one of the biggest changes over the past couple of years, since 2008, has been the implementation of the Secure Communities program, right? Which has basically turned every encounter with law enforcement into a risk of deportation now, and so many of the growth in the number of deportations, especially within the interior, has largely been a product of this program. And, I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests that that's really fundamentally changed the relationship between the Latino community and police and other local governmental and civic organizations, right? Now, Secure Communities was terminated formally by President Obama, replaced with something called the Priority Enforcement Program. And that was a move which was pretty celebrated. But I went ahead and I read the ICE memos establishing the Priority Enforcement Program. And this is a change in pretty much name only. Substantively, the program is identical to Secure Communities. The program states that it's still the case that whenever somebody's booked, their fingerprints get sent to ICE. ICE still has the discretion to ask local law enforcement agencies to hold these people. The memo clarifies that local law enforcement agencies are not required to hold them, that it's merely requested, but that was already clarified as true under Secure Communities. The memo states that ICE will prioritize the deportation of criminals, but ICE already historically prioritized the deportation of criminals, and ICE retains the discretion to deport non-criminals. And so, it's a different name, and maybe the numbers will bear out over a few years that the level of enforcement will decline, but substantively, it's an identical program.
That's right. Well,
and Francisco.
Oh yeah, please.
I want to add one other, I think, underappreciated feature of contemporary immigration enforcement. And that's the idea that this prioritization effort, it's coming directly from the Kool-Aid we've all drank on the importance of economics. The key and one of the key sort of like trump cards that economists lay down is the importance and value of efficiency, okay? And that is fundamentally the reason why we've had this prioritization effort. And I have a problem with that for a couple of reasons. The big one is that what you've done is ceded to bureaucrats the power to now create new tiers of membership in the polity, which really has a perverse effect on the idea that all are created equal. If we're committed to the notion of equality in the U.S., and cede over to bureaucrats power to systematically create new levels of citizenship. We're not talking about second-class citizenship. We're talking about third-class, fourth-class, fifth-class citizenship in the way that we interface with government. That's a real problem, and we've got lots of history to show that we've run up against those challenges, and it doesn't end pretty. The other thing that I want to point out here is that when we think about this multi-tiered citizenship that is developing, a very controversial statement from an immigration scholar named Mike Welch, he suggests this should be a concern for folks, even those who occupy the most privileged tiers of membership in the U.S. And the reason why is because they could potentially be used, these experiments and these new ideas of interpretations of what rights you have as citizens vis-a-vis law enforcement agencies could potentially then be used to set precedent on the way that bureaucrats engage with all citizens in general. Okay? So it becomes problematic then, for example, to create judicial systems of immigration proceedings that forego all of the traditional sort of channels of due process, for example, because now you've got in our legal system a set of arguments that say for these conditions we can sort of forego due process. So as long as this other sort of act out here, if we can classify that as being so terrible, so awful, that no need for due process there, it's not that much of a jump to say that we can then start applying this in other areas of law. So I'll leave it at that as sort of another way that we can think about immigration enforcement being a much broader concern than it's characterized now.
David, any final words? Well, let's take the panel again. This was fantastic.
Thank you all very much.